Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to uGather, the last uGather of our school year. I'm sitting out on my back porch this time, just enjoying the beautiful Lincoln weather. We had no snow this week. We had no hail this week. We had no storms this week. And it's sunny and going to be about 78 degrees in Lincoln, but that's always the way it is in Lincoln. So just welcome. Glad you're here. Welcome to our guests who are not a part of the Union College family. We're excited that you're also joining us for this very special presentation that we have today. We just scrolled through all the announcements of things that are happening on campus. And if you missed them, stay with us at the very end of our program. We will scroll through those again so you can see what's happening. But there are activities happening from campus ministries, from your ASB, from the church, just the traditional and then some activities to try and keep our campus connected even during this time of quarantine. So hope you're still healthy and staying well and looking for ways that you can do something for someone else. So today we're going to be blessed by a challenge that to me is just going to be a reminder that this is more than about me staying healthy. This is also about me intentionally doing something to bless other people. So I challenge you today or this week sometime to call someone and just ask them, how you doing? Look for a way to go to the food bank or go to the shelter or go to some service organization and just say, can I help? And just do something in this time of crisis that will make a difference, not only in your life, but in someone else's life. So I'm just excited to hear our special guest today. And we're glad that Linda Becker is going to be with us. She's going to tune in right now and join me on the screen. She's been an administrator at Union College. She's still an adjunct teacher at Union College, leading out in our leadership program. And she's actively involved in our community, part of which was the preparation for last week's Mayor's Prayer Conference. So Linda, would you be willing to take a minute and introduce our guest to us and tell us about this special program?
I would be delighted. Good morning, Union. Our guest today is Nipun Mehta. He is the founder of ServiceSpace.org. And you've probably heard about this space in some form. It's an incubator of projects that support a gift culture. In his mid-20s, Nipun quit his job and became a full-time volunteer. And over the last 15 years, his work has reached millions, attracted more than 500,000 volunteers, and mushroomed into numerous projects like Daily Good, Awaken Circles, and the Karma Kitchen, which I can't wait to hear more about. Among his many prestigious accolades, President Obama appointed him on a Council for Social Change. Dalai Lama recognized him as an unsung hero of compassion, and Germany's magazine named him top 100 most inspiring people of 2018. He has addressed thousands of gatherings around the world, speaking next to wide-ranging leaders from Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak to author Ellen Gilbert and civil rights legend John Lewis. We are absolutely privileged to have you with us today, Nipun, and we welcome you to uGather at Union College.
Thank you, Linda. It's such a joy to be here. We were supposed to be in person, but we are improvising, and I'm delighted to still be exploring the spiritual connection with all of you. I wanted to talk a little bit about compassion. It's one of my favorite topics, and this idea of cultivating compassion quotient. We know about IQ, intellectual quotient. We know about EQ, especially in the last decade or two. It's become very popular, emotional quotient. But what is compassion quotient? How do we grow in it? How have I personally grown in it? And how do we support others? And I think this is a very relevant theme, especially given the context of the pandemic that we're in. There is so much uncertainty, and with that uncertainty, so much fear. And how will we respond? And how does compassion play a role? So we actually, maybe by mid-March or something, we looked at all the news, and it got pretty depressing, right? Like so much was going on. Our lives were turned completely upside down. And there were these question marks about what happens next, what will happen to me. But in the middle of that, we were also seeing, while that was sort of the mainstream dominant paradigm narrative, there was also this incredible, just absolutely incredible outpouring of love, of compassion, of people reaching out to each other, people singing from balconies, you know, it was like the whole, it just warmed your heart. And so we thought that we should presence this narrative. And so we created a portal called coronavirus. Karuna now is a Sanskrit word which means compassion. So it sounds like corona, but it's actually way more contagious than corona. Compassion is very deeply contagious. And so just in preparing for this call, I thought that I would just go on the site and see what are the top stories. There's hundreds of stories there. It's now been several months. I think every week there's like every day there's like 10, 15 stories that are posted up. So I just have a few slides here just to give you some visuals. Let me see if I can put them on. But these are just stories of compassion that at the moment are on the website, but I think it just tells a different story of who we are, how we can respond, and perhaps the kind of patterns we can design for in the future. So this is South Africa. All the gangs in South Africa who were previously fighting with each other, they called a truce. And they said, you know what, let's just help people during the times of the pandemic. This is a chef in LA. His restaurant clearly shut down, but he says, you know what, I want to respond with compassion. Why don't I use my skills to go feed people? And so he started just doing what he could, and then go into the hospitals and just feeding the healthcare workers, the frontline workers. Every day he started making about 100 enchiladas, and lots of people started supporting him. And now he's like, although his restaurant shut down, he is continuing to do this work in beautiful ways. This is the New Zealand Prime Minister who decided, she's been doing all kinds of amazing things, but she decided to take, she and her administration decided to take a 20% pay cut in solidarity with others who are also suffering at this time. This is an amazing story of a 99-year-old World War II veteran in Britain who says, you know what, I care, my heart goes out, but I'm 99, I need a walker, what can I do? He decides to do a little fundraiser. And he takes his walker and he walks around his backyard. He just does these laps. And he's raised more than $22 million for pounds, I believe, 22 million pounds for the healthcare workers who are, you know, who are clearly in need of so many different things right now, so they can serve the patients who have caught the coronavirus. So you see these beautiful things. Here's one last one that's also on the site. It's just like, you know, this is in Florida. The police got together and they decided to do this for the hospital staff, right? Like, oh, hey, thank you. The FMPD thanks you for your service and creating a nice little heart shape. So you see these examples, and it's not just a one-off thing, right? It's something that's very present. You know, all over the world, not just in the United States even. And so what is this force? But of course, it's not just that it's there. It's like these times, it's kind of a weird time, right? Because in a way, post-disaster, everyone responds with compassion. There's a lot of research on this as well. But now, especially in this time, there's very two peculiar differences than a traditional disaster. One is we have to be socially distanced. So how do you reach out and connect when you have to be farther apart? And the other is that this is not a short-term thing. This is not just like, hey, let's, you know, this hurricane came, we are going to address this and things are going to return to normal. We don't actually even know what normal looks like. And so all of this put together starts to really make it even more difficult to see where we want to land, see where we want to be anchored in our hearts. So it's and yet we do have very compelling research. I mean, I was just reading yesterday this research from Max Planck Institute, which said that if you want to be happier, and you can just connecting with one person will make you happier. Connecting with another person, building this deep bond, this deep relationship will make you happier than doing self-improvement courses. And it was a very large study out of Germany. And so how do we, what does it mean to connect in these times? What does it mean to be compassionate? So that's sort of the preamble to the compassion quotient. Now, what I want to share are three sort of core markers in my journey of growing in compassion. Three stages. And I'll use this to also share a little bit about my own background and some of the experiments that we have done. The first is the first stage, the first station on this journey for me was something very simple, something that we all relate to, which is give. You go out and, instead of being me-centered, how do we start to be we-centered? So back in 1999, a few of us, back when I was your age, a few of us went to a homeless shelter, and we went in and we said, hey, we'd love to help. What can we do? And they looked at us and they said, well, you tell us, what can you do? And we ended up building them a website. At that time, they didn't even know what websites were. Now I'm really dating myself, right? This is 1999. So we built them a website, and that was great. It was a homeless shelter, and they got a lot out of it. But even more than the website, it actually was very transformative experience in generosity for us. And we, instead of expecting thank you from them, we were like, oh, thank you for the opportunity to let us grow in service. And we came back and we couldn't help but tell our friends, hey man, this generosity thing, it's good. It's like, we should really explore it. It's not something you save for when you're retired, just do it now. And lots of people joined. We ended up building thousands of websites for other nonprofits. But underneath it, it was this drive of generosity. And what was compelling now in retrospect, when I look back at that this generosity is, we can confuse it with various different expressions of generosity, right? I think there is a sympathy response, there is an empathy response, but this compassion is a third thing altogether. And neuroscience now backs all this up, that these are three very different parts of our brain. Sympathy is a very low bandwidth way of giving. It's good, it's way better than taking, but it's very low bandwidth way of giving. Empathy, which is a different part of your brain, is where you actually feel the pain of others. It's almost as if you are experiencing it yourself. And that leads to burnout. But compassion is where you're able to, where you care, but you're able to distinguish between other people's pain and your pain, so you're not taking it all on. And it's a very different part of your brain, and it's very regenerative. It's inexhaustible. And so this was, for me, the first stage of generosity, of my compassion journey, is just to tap into this heart of giving, tap into this heart of service. But not giving in a sympathy way. Rachel Naomi Remen has a very beautiful quote. She says, when we help, you see life as weak. When you fix, you see life as broken. When you serve, you see life as a co-created whole. And so how do we respond to life? How do we give in a way that is not about, that doesn't cheapen the process? That's not saying I have and you give, but it's actually realizing that I have and I'm giving in some ways, but I'm also receiving in other ways. And that actually was the second big junction. If the first one was about giving, the second big station for me was about receiving. And receiving is, it's like, yeah, who doesn't want to receive? But when you give, it's actually impossible, I have found, to give without receiving. You are invariably going to receive, but we make these errors in judgment because sometimes we give apples and we get oranges back. And we're looking for apples, so we're like, oh, I didn't notice that oranges, but we're actually always receiving. And we're usually, by the magnificence of nature, I think we are always receiving exactly what we need for our growth. And so it's a very powerful process that goes on. And for me, the greatest example of this are my parents. I show you this slide. So my parents, here we go. So this is a photo of my parents every Wednesday. Now this is pre-pandemic time, maybe I want to say 21 years ago now. Every Wednesday they decided that in their own home, they're going to host this circle. So 7 p.m. Wednesday, middle of the week, and says, hey, this is a space. If you want to practice mindfulness, if you want to practice meditation, if you want a space of quiet, we're going to move our couches and you can just sit and have that space. And then in the second hour, we did a circle of sharing where everyone shared their aha moments of the week. And then in the third hour, my mom said, hey, Nipun, at that time I was living at home. It's like, I got to feed you. So I'll feed whoever else comes. And it was remarkable because what they did was they left, instead of leaving the door closed, they actually left it open, not just metaphorically, but literally, so anyone could come. And over the last 21 years, they've hosted it every single Wednesday. And this last month, it's all been virtual, but they've probably, my mom has probably fed her own home cooked food to about close to 50,000 people that walked into this home. And now it's in all kinds of places around it. In fact, I think even in Lincoln, there is an awaken circle. They call them, we used to call them just Wednesdays, but now they're awaken circles where you're awakening, but with kin. So it's AWAKIN. And so even in places like Lincoln, there are these awaken circles where you can just be in community. But the most remarkable thing about it, and the reason why I put this in the receiving category, is that invariably people would go, this is our shoe rack, by the way, outside. People leave their shoes outside, and here's a couple of visuals of awaken circles happening in other places around the world. But as people leave, invariably they're so grateful. And they come up to my mom or my dad, but especially my mom, given the context of food, they would go up and say, Auntie, thank you. And my mom would say, no, thank you for the opportunity to give. Because you came and gave me a chance to practice generosity. And because I practiced generosity, I received so much. So thank you. And most people look at that and they're a little confused. They're like, what do you mean, man? You're doing all this work and you're thanking me for taking from you? And it sounds like that from a cursory glance, but when you've had front row seats like I have, watching them, it's absolutely true that they have received so much. And you see this you sometimes don't see it right away, but it's very present, and you see it over time. It's unmistakable. Its impact is unmistakable. I remember my mom happened to be alone for a few weeks while my dad was on a retreat. And at one point I think it was past 10 or something like that, all of a sudden she hears these like noises, thump, thump, thump. And she hears these noises and she's like, oh my God, what do I do? And so her first response is, okay, turn the lights on. She thought it was gunshots. And so she turns the lights on to indicate that, hey, someone's home. And sure enough, she turns the lights on, but the noises still continue. It happens again, thump, 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 And she said, well, what am I going to do? She tries to see where it is. It's actually not coming from her bedroom window, but the living room window. So she goes out to the living room. And now the sensible thing to do would have been to call 911. Like, this is what my mom of 20 years ago would have done. But now if you've hosted all these people day in and day out, it completely transforms you, right? Because so my mom is looking at this situation and saying, why is a physical wall creating a boundary in my heart? There is a wall. There are some pranksters on the other side doing something that feels very threatening to me. But you know what? They could have come in any Wednesday and done all kinds of things. So I open my home and my heart every Wednesday. Why am I shutting it down now? And so my mom decides to do something that to me as her son was like, just feels so radical for her personality, to actually, she decides to go in and greet these people, to go in, opens the door, goes out. Turns out to be three pranksters. So three young kids, like maybe 11 or 12 years old. They were taking these old oranges and just throwing them, right? Like doing their little thing, what 11-year-olds do. But what was even more remarkable is that my mom, as soon as they see my mom, they're like, oh, run away. It's like the teacher's in class, like, run away, stop doing what you're doing. But my mom actually reaches out to them. Instead of that wanting them to go away out of fear, she actually reaches out, puts her hands out and says, hey kids, I actually feed people. Do you have things that I can use? Like, holding out a hand and building that relationship with things that just a few moments ago you were afraid of. And so when people come into her house and they thank her, saying, Auntie, thank you for this hosting this circle. And she says, no, thank you for the opportunity to give. You realize that actually taking those opportunities to give is transforming you in a very deep way. So it becomes extremely powerful. And so that's the second sort of stage, where if the first one is giving, the second one is really about receiving. That if you give in this deep way, there's just no way you will not receive. You may not immediately be able to identify it, but it's very much there, and it transforms everything about you. And in fact, that's so meaningful that it is actually, no matter how much you've given it, the value of that pales in comparison to the value of what you're receiving. And then the third and final stage is actually about what I think of as dancing. So you give, you receive, and dance. And dance is really about this, in dancing, sometimes you give a little bit, sometimes you have to receive a little bit. It's dynamic. And so dancing is really not about it's about not keeping track, because sometimes, even though we understand we're giving, we keep track of how much we're giving, we keep track of how much we're receiving, and we have these ledgers. And dancing is really about just releasing all of those ledgers. One of my friends had this beautiful practice. He happened to be very affluent, and he had this practice where he would walk in to a restaurant, and as he's having a meal, he would go to the waiter and he would choose a random table, and he would tell them, hey, you go tell them someone anonymous has paid for their meal. Now this guy, because he was affluent, he would go to very, very fancy, pricey places, right? So a couple $100 per person kind of places. And so one time he walks in and calls the waiter and tells the waiter, hey, you know the drill, this guy's hero is like Batman, right? So he wants to be completely anonymous. And he's like, you know the drill. Go. And so he somehow identifies this one table. It's a couple, it's a high-end restaurant in New York. And he tells the waiter, just tell them someone anonymously has paid for their meal. Now, the waiter goes in, does the drill, and as soon as he tells them that it's just this random act of kindness that someone has done, someone has paid for your meal, it was a couple, they just start weeping. And he, initially the waiter thought that, they're just overwhelmed by gratitude. And so he kind of left them alone. But then he saw that it was something much more. and they weren't stopping. How do we, they were really, really taken by this. And so he goes up and the couple on the table says, can you tell us who did this? We really just want to say thank you. Now, this guy was like given very specific instructions. You cannot say who paid for, you cannot out the Batman, right? So he comes back to the donor table and he says, sir, I know you don't want, you want to be anonymous, but I really think it would be so meaningful for them to be able to say thank you to you. And so they have this chat. And finally, he kind of breaks this cover and Mr. Batman shows up on this table. And the couple says, we have been married a year. This is our 1-year anniversary. And we could never afford to eat at a place like this. We actually run a very humble nonprofit that works with developmentally challenged kids. And to know that on that one day when we're out here celebrating, that the universe is listening and that our tab is paid for by someone we don't know, just means the whole world to us, and we just want to say thank you. And they start weeping, my friend who gave the money starts weeping. They created this deep bond, and he's still on their board of the nonprofit, and there's been so many other ripples that have happened. But in that scenario, right, if we ask ourselves, who was giving and who was receiving? Was my friend giving? He was. In terms of financial capital, he certainly was. But he clearly received something so priceless, so meaningful, and that ended up changing his life. And now, can you quantify these things? Do we even need to ask such a silly question of like, oh, was that worth it? Was that not worth it? Did I get enough? Did I give enough? You just release and let all that go and just dance. Maybe I received more, maybe I gave more. That's not the kind of mathematics. That's not the kind of spreadsheet that I need to be keeping track of. And that's sort of this deep final stage of generosity. And so in conclusion here, I want to share a couple more slides here, if you can see. So as I said, there's this give is the first stage, receiving is the second stage, and dancing is the third stage. And I think what happens with dancing, when, even before giving, there's the taking, right? If you don't look at that spectrum of compassion and service and generosity, on the other end of the spectrum is taking. And taking is characterized by accumulation and transaction, right? More than even that. So your transaction, give and take, give and take. But as you move away from that transaction and you start to go deeper on your journey of generosity and much deeper compassion, we realize that things start to shift from transaction to relationship. You see these kids here, Linda mentioned Karma Kitchen. I didn't get to talk about Karma Kitchen today, but it's a restaurant where everyone pays for each other. Your check is zero because someone before you has paid for your meal, and you are trusted to pay forward for people after you. It's like the kids on the screen, right? Everyone is giving a shoulder rub to the person in front of them, and everyone is taken care of. You might give a great rub, you may not receive such a great shoulder rub, but what you get in return for that is the whole circle. You get the relationships. And so you start to move from transaction to relationships. And as you start to move in that direction, another way to frame it is to shift from direct reciprocity, I gave this, what am I getting in return, right? To something a little bit broader, which is indirect reciprocity, which is where you have the whole circle. And then I think the real maturing of this journey, especially when compassion starts to get ignited in us, is this process of infinite reciprocity, where you're not even looking. It's like that circle is so vast, so big, that you're just doing the principled thing. You're doing the right thing, that you're doing, the thing that is that feels virtuous to you, and you want nothing in return because it's going to play itself out in the larger cosmic laws of the world. So that journey to go from direct reciprocity to indirect to infinite is really a journey to go from these really loose relationships, these cheap relationships, loose ties, as they call it, as network scientists call it, to very deep ties, and ultimately to very noble, sacred ties. And the reason why this is so significant, because for those of you, I'm from the Silicon Valley, I used to be, I'm still an engineer, I suppose, in some sense, but that's been my formal training. And network scientists will tell you that in a room full of 50 people, if you just do this one-to-many broadcast, you will have 50 connections. But if you move to a telephone where everyone can talk to each other in a one-to-one network, with just 50 people, you have 1,225 connections that are possible. And in a many-to-many network, the internet era network, and most certainly the pandemic network that we see how things can just virally spread, with just 50 people, the number of connections that are possible is 100 million trillion. And what really, why this is so significant with and how it relates to compassion is that if this kind of a network, a many-to-many network, which is everyday life, especially visible during times of the pandemic, when we're all interacting with each other so deeply, if that network is animated with these sacred, noble ties, it ignites everything in a very different way. It is the contagion of compassion. And that is incredibly powerful. So bring it back full circle to coronavirus, right? You look at these small acts. This is a fellow in San Francisco, always wanted to start a coffee shop. Now he's quarantined and he says, anyone going by, I will be giving them, he makes coffee and hands it out from his window in a socially distanced kind of a way. You have this photo from Israel where these paramedics were just finished with a 77-year-old guy, a gentleman who had exposure to COVID and really struggling. They come out and they both start praying in their own different ways, right? Two paramedics, one is Muslim, one is Jewish, and both of them spreading compassion through prayer. This is a cellist in Maryland. She obviously can't go anywhere and there's no concert halls, and she just has to play for anyone who's going through. And so you see a couple of people there just sitting and enjoying her music. And that's her expression of giving back, of tapping into that space of compassion herself. And this is an Italian priest. This is such a touching story. This is in the early days of the virus in Italy. It was just like, the situation is really dire. And this Italian priest realizes that there is a young man who's also infected with the coronavirus, and he is also infected with the coronavirus. Both of them need a ventilator, and there's only one available. And he says, you know what? I've lived a long life. I'm going to give it to the young man. And he actually passes away. And so in his case, he actually gave his life. And so what does that mean to, when you have a web of this many-to-many web that we're already enmeshed in, and when we get ignited with compassion, and we introduce those deep, noble bonds, these deep relationships, sacred relationships into that network, it actually animates and creates a fundamentally different ripple effect, and a much more powerful ripple effect that changes the world because you have ignited compassion in your heart. So thank you very much for your kind attention, wherever you are, all over the country, I presume, maybe even around the world. But it's a real joy. Sorry we couldn't connect in person, but I hope we can build on this friendship. I hope you get, maybe there's talks. In fact, the mayor herself has spoken about creating a Lincoln version of coronavirus I hope you go out and do small acts of love, of kindness, in a responsible way. But just reach out and connect. I think it'll make you happier. It'll make the other person happier, and it'll actually animate the web of our humanity. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Ryan, and I'm going to just hop in here and help facilitate maybe some questions from our audience. I would encourage you, if you do have any questions, we have about 5 minutes or so that Mr. Mehta would be happy to answer your questions. So feel free to type them in your YouTube chat window. We have one that came in already from the audience. And the question is, during these trying times, what do you think people need the most?
I think what people need the most now, and was true even, I think now is just more out of the shadows, is connection. I think we want to feel connected, to ourselves, not in a way of fear, but in a way that's much more wholesome. I think we want to feel connected to other people. This is why you see people, going out in balconies and yeah, around here, at 8 p.m., everyone starts howling and saying, "I'm here," and we may be physically apart, but we are in social solidarity. So I think we want to we also long for that connection. And I think it's also a creative challenge for us to see how we can use this context to actually create designs and systems which perhaps put that connection at the forefront and not at the tail end, which is how the previous systems were.
And it sounds like the website you referenced, coronavirus, actually, since it's sharing stories, that could be a trigger for lots of great ideas. Can you tell us the URL, spell it out, make sure we're getting it right for that website?
Yeah, sure. Karuna is a Sanskrit word for compassion. It's Karuna, and virus is virus, virus. So Karuna, virus.org. And you'll see hundreds of these stories from all over the world. I mean, if you're ever down and you feel like, oh my God, the world's, what's happening to the world, it's a very reasonable thing to feel these days. Just go to the site and just read some of the stories, and I can guarantee you it just lifts your heart and makes you realize that human beings are kind of awesome.
Yeah, and hopefully trigger some great ideas that we can all start in our own communities as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we have a couple of more questions that have come in. One of those is, how do you resist pride of recognition or whatever so that you don't rob yourself from receiving when you give?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think sometimes the ego comes in and you start feeling like you have done something. But I think the way we think about it, there's this phrase that we often use in ServiceSpace. It's called multiple forms of capital. So there is one form of capital, maybe the material. Let's say I'm helping a homeless person with a meal, and now I'm clearly giving something and that the person doesn't have. I have food, the homeless man doesn't have food, and so I'm giving that. But that's one form of capital, but there's so many other forms of capital that maybe the smile of the homeless person, the gratitude of the homeless person is something that I can learn from. So to be tuned in to realize that you are certainly not to misacknowledge or deny the gifts that you are offering, but to also look at the whole spectrum and say, I'm offering this, but I'm also receiving a lot, in these other ways. I think that really helps keep pride in check.
Great. And then another question, which is a question I had as well. What organizations do you help with or run, and what are the difficulties and benefits of sharing or of starting a nonprofit for someone who's thinking about starting one? I mean, you've already mentioned several things that you've been involved in. So what are some things to think about for people that would love to get involved in even starting their own nonprofit?
Yeah, so we started a nonprofit called ServiceSpace. So things like Karma Kitchen and a lot of the projects that I've spoken about, Awaken Circles, even doing acts of kindness and smile cards are all a part of ServiceSpace. So please go check it out and you'll learn a lot about it. But more fundamentally, I think the biggest challenge that people face is getting caught in the fundraising trap. You know, initially you start and you say, man, I just have this well-meaning thing that I want to be doing. And by the 5th year, you're thinking, oh, how can I make this look a certain way? By the 15th year, you've got 10 fundraisers with you and one person doing the act. You know, I mean, that's an exaggeration to a degree, but your lens becomes very fundraising oriented. And so you lose touch with the other forms of capital. And money is actually a very degenerative capital, right? The more, as you use it, you lose it. But things like smiles and hugs and compassion are regenerative. The more you smile, the more you want to smile, right? This is just this is actually science. The more you hug, you want to hug. And the more you're compassionate, the more you want to be compassionate. So how do we start to design in a way that actually is leading with regenerative capitals? I think that's the biggest challenge. And we actually run these laddership circles, not just leadership, but laddership, the servant leadership idea, but even taking that to a next level. And so I would really recommend going to laddership, LADDERSHIP.org. It's a 6-week peer learning circle. And again, all of this is commercial free. All of this is all a gift. It's just run by people. It's people helping people. So change makers coming together with each other and saying, how can we innovate? How can we think out of the box?
Well, thank you very much for sharing with us. This has been very inspiring, and certainly would encourage people, audience out there, if you want to learn more, check out ServiceSpace.org as well as coronavirus.org and laddership.org, these websites that Mr. Mehta has shared with us to learn more. Our time is about up, so I'm going to, again, say thank you very much for your time and bring Pastor Rich back in to finish off with our prayer for the day.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks, Ryan. Thank Nipun very much for blessing us and for challenging us and encouraging us with the value of looking beyond ourselves, looking to others, which has the residual benefit of blessing us. So it's just a cool relationship. And I just thank you for what you've committed to and what you've challenged us to commit our lives to. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're going to end now with our prayer requests that have been coming in. Daniel, I think, is going to put them up on the screen right now. These are our campus family prayer requests that you've been submitting to us. And we'd like to end our uGather today by just praying for them and praying for our community, our society, our world. That God will lead all of us to find that place in our lives that we can make a difference for someone else. So let's pray together as we end, shall we? Dear Lord, thank you. Thank you for the challenge of Nipun and for the way you have blessed him so he can be a blessing to others. And God, you've blessed all of us as well. And I just pray that you will lead us and guide us in a way to show us how we can use what you've given us, not just for ourselves, but for the care of our neighbor, whoever that might be, next door or across the ocean. Thank you for the prayer requests that have been submitted, the praises, the requests, the pains, the struggles that some are going through. We don't have answers to all of them, but you do. And while they're being resolved or answered or dealt with, I pray that you will share with us something on this list. Perhaps our list has the initial specific need that I can say, oh, I could minister to that. I can pray specifically for that. I could help that person with that. And so God, we take all these requests, we put them in your hands because we know that you know how to take care of them better than we do. But we commit ourselves again to living our lives not centered on ourselves, but as you demonstrated love by giving of your Son, may we demonstrate love by giving of ourselves to the needs of others. So thank you for the blessing and the inspiration and the challenge of this time together do something with it in our lives is my prayer now in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. We're going to put the slides back on so you can scroll through those and see the events that are happening this weekend. Look forward to one more uGather next week as we wrap up the school year. We're going to have a dedication of our student missionaries who are still planning to go next year. So be with us next week, same time. We'll see you then. Have a great week and blessings to all of you.